You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Greetings and welcome everyone to another episode of Seeking the Hidden Thing podcast. It is my delight to have Athenian stranger joining me again to continue our discussion on Gadamer. Welcome, Athenian.
Thank you so much for having me again. I really am enjoying these collaborations we're doing on this particular text. This is really good stuff.
Yeah, and for the audience, most of you are missing his and my stream of text messages back and forth, with pictures of pages, notation. Me maybe more so than Athenian. So that's one of the fun things, is just sort of the both of us going through the process of discovery is a lot of fun. Normally you do that by yourself, but it's fun to collaborate with somebody and share that sort of experience of discovery and rediscovery.
Yeah.
We're in the midst. Okay, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, let me just add something here for the readers to really, well, not the readers, but the listeners. For the listeners to really understand, this is the whole point of why friendship is so crucial within Plato and in Aristotle for the philosophical life. It's not simply crucial as a kind of ornament to the good life. It is definitive of the philosophical life for Plato and Aristotle. Because, and Xenophon, by the way, Xenophon as well, it is the sharing together of what Xenophon, Socrates says, is the great treasures of old that the wise have left for us. And whenever we find something good, which is to say something that will help us improve ourselves in a virtuous way, then we share it. And in that respect, one is living the good life by way of philosophy through the sharing of ideas with friends. And I just can't recommend this enough. Philosophy is not done on your own in your study or anything like that. Philosophy is done with those few rare good friends that you get to share ideas with, because you learn so much more that way than you ever will by yourself. So I just want to emphasize why things like this, these kinds of projects, are so important. I encourage anyone who's listening to, find a good friend and say, look, we're going to read a book together, right? And just go from there.
Well, and I couldn't underscore this more. And it's on two levels, like maybe three thoughts. One is that this kind of coming together with friends is sort of aha moments as you discover something together and you discover something about each other, is precisely what Gadamer is talking about. That there develops a third thing between you as you understand, you come to understand and develop this shared space. So this is, in a sense, what we're doing here, Athenian and I, is basically we're doing Gadamer's philosophy. And this is also, in some sense, the tragedy of philosophy, is that so often it isolates the people who do it because it's so hard to do. And generally, it requires a certain level of intelligence, and people that are both interested and capable are often hard to find. And so for most of us, in our daily lives, you run into the experience that you read philosophy and you have all these ideas bouncing around your head and nobody cares. And while we can criticize the sort of the massification process that social media and other media bring on society, one of the things that these technologies and mediums like podcasting and video space is, I would never have gotten to know someone like Athenian otherwise. And as a result, even though there is no Athenian in my neighborhood, in my circle of friends here in life, I would just be a guy reading books on his own for his own enjoyment. I can now have a conversation and expand and develop and refine the things I know because of my relationship with him and others in this community. So this is the kind of, in a sense, and for many of us who are, like like Athena, this is, in a sense, was the value of the university. And what the university was supposed to be was to gather men like us together who otherwise would be alone in their village, the shaman or whatever. And now we can come together and discuss these ideas and extend and expand them. But we do so now that, in a sense, these online media have become, in many ways, the new university. So this is kind of what we're doing here. So, yeah, it's, and from a person, I think nobody can develop themselves in isolation. This is, Paul Ricoeur's oneself is another, and it's been noted again and again that you can't know yourself without there being someone else to observe you from the outside, because you will deceive yourself about who you are. And so there's things you hide from yourself, and you need your friend to make visible yourself to you. And so there's sometimes things that you're saying, the implications of which you haven't even realized. And your friend will say, like, I like this thing that you're saying, but have you really thought through the implications of what you're saying? And then can open up for something for you that you had never really considered before. So, yeah, it's been a real wonder. So it's been a real delight to do this. And so hopefully you as an audience, some of the posts that we've been making in regards to announcing it have been some of my best performing notes on the sort of Substack notes platform, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
So to begin, I guess here, just a couple things of note as we get into the beginning of the thing. And for those of you who are following along, you will note that part 1 of Truth and Method begins with this, has this title, the first 160 pages or so in the second edition, The Question of Truth as It Emerges in the Experience of Art. And you might be asking yourself, well, because Gadamer doesn't really actually tell you why. And you won't figure it out until probably section 2 or so, if you figure it out all, because he never really actually makes it explicit, is that he begins with art and the problem of truth and the problem of method in regards to, and the question of, can you come to a point of having sure knowledge of the truth? And he approaches this through art in many ways, because art lacks the kind of rational content that, say, a text does, or scientific inquiry does, where you have the content and the data of actual observations. And so when you begin with art, you are in some ways setting aside the rational linguistic component for later. And so he begins, and in part because in many ways, even though other thinkers have said lots about art, the explicit connections between that and this notion of, like, a sure foundation of truth have not really been made. And so by beginning with art, he's able to make the arguments that he's going to make without having to carry with it a lot of the baggage of, dealing with the, texts and the author and, faithfulness to the text, even things like accurate historical representation, questions that we often deal with, say, in biblical hermeneutics, the Bible as history and all these things. So, and then, like the questions we had, like with COVID and stuff, follow the science and stuff. All of those questions get set aside, and he's able to develop his theory of understanding and truth with ahead of all of that. So by the time you start to deal with questions of observation, data, and language, you already have the theory has already been laid out for you, and it allows you then the avenue into all of the specifics that we normally deal with. And then in terms of his methodology, Gadamer, in some sense, it doesn't seem always to be building an argument. He's often just talking about different ideas, and he isn't necessarily, at least on the surface, is always making a case, like where you would say, make an argument, cite citations in the history or whatever. He just begins by picking up a number of concepts. Like, we have like the wreckage of modernity. We're in postmodernity, and there is you know, truth is suspect, and he's trying to rebuild the pieces. And so he begins by finding in the history of philosophy a series of ideas and pieces that he will begin to sort of, he pulls them out and then just starts talking about them. And it really, you get it, you're in the book about 120 or so pages before he actually begins to say, so the point I'm making is this. And then he will start to, so you're already in about, you're like, the book is 600 pages long. So you're already over a sixth of the way through the book. And he hasn't actually told you what he thinks yet. He's just talking about the various. But if you're an astute reader, and if you've gone through this several times, you can begin to see that what he's doing is he's making the argument by leading the reader through the process of understanding. So you're basically doing the thing that he's talking about in the end. You're doing. He's in some ways drawing you into the process of doing the very thing he's making the argument that you should be doing about pursuing truth. Which is it's a very sort of sly way of making his argument, but he never really makes the argument, so that by the end of it, you just are supposed to kind of understand, and you arrive at a place of understanding without feeling necessarily like you've been forced or led there. He's just basically going to expose to you all of these bits and pieces out of the history of philosophy and various observations and examples that he's going to explore. And once you've explored all these examples of things, you can kind of have a picture that you will intuit and you'll put together, and then you will have understanding. But you don't necessarily have a very sort of like syllogistic type of argument that you can then make, but you have a 600-page understanding that now you can then apply elsewhere. Which is good. I think for some may find that somewhat frustrating, because he's going to actually ask you to hold the whole 600 thing to do. So there you go. So those are my kind of opening thoughts as we begin to get into it more. And you said you had a couple of thoughts as well before we dive into the actual substance of the text.
Yeah, I mean, so what the listeners don't know is that Kryptos and I have been talking about how we want to even structure these discussions. Do we just start together, both of us, and just start kicking ideas around? That's one way. That's certainly how we did the first discussion. And for this discussion, because what he and I are doing is we're reading it on our own, and then of course we're bouncing ideas back and forth off each other. Kryptos will send me 20 texts in a day, and I'll send him an entire 5 to 10 minute voice memo, right? I mean, no one likes to be on the receiving end of that. Geez. But what I suggested for this time, and maybe we can get some of the listeners their feedback on what they think is the best way to go about this. But what I suggested to Kryptos is that, he begin with a kind of opening discussion of what he finds for this particular discussion helpful, and then I do the same. Now, what I've done is I've put together a kind of presentation here, but it's designed so that it, along with showing what's going on with Gadamer here, it also reveals how one should even go about reading great books. And effectively what I've done is, as I'm reading, I always keep a notepad close to me, and I just begin to make notes on everything that I come across, but in particular the structure of how he's presented them, because that's with Gadamer. You have to realize we got a 600-page text here. Okay, this is unwieldy to say the least. So I presume that Gadamer also realized, look, this is a tome, right? This talk about a thomist, right? This is a tome. So I presume that Gadamer himself thought about this and arranged it very, very meticulously. And you see that in the table of contents. I mean, you have three. So the book itself is arranged in three parts. You have part one, which is the question of truth as it emerges in the experience of art. Now, my suggestion for people is that they keep very, very clearly in their mind every single one of these titles for the various sections as you're going through them, because Gadamer is not always going to even tell us how the title relates to the content of the section, because what he's forcing us to do is he's forcing us to do philosophy as he understands it while presenting his thoughts about philosophy. So you're doing philosophy while understanding what he wants you to realize about his philosophy. So part one, the question of truth as it emerges in the experience of art. All right. Something about art and the experience of art is going to be definitive for the first 157 pages. Then you have part
even
two.
that word experience is loaded.
Exactly. All of these, yeah, because we also have to keep in mind, Gadamer is dealing in the realm of hermeneutics, or what we could say is language itself, and what actually is language, and how does it transmit anything to us, and what does it even mean to transmit? So in many respects, he's and keep in mind, he's a student of Heidegger, and Heidegger specifically referred to his own understanding of philosophy as not simply phenomenology, but hermeneutical phenomenology. So, and Gadamer is right on board with Heidegger in some very, very significant things, which I'll get to. But then you have part two, and then that's the extension of the question of truth. Okay, the extension of the question of truth. So somehow the question of truth is already in part one, and he's extending it in part two to understanding. So this thing we call understanding in the human sciences. Okay, so that's going to take us from roughly page 170 all the way to page 360 or 380. So there's the meat of the book right there. And then you've got part three, which is, he titles The Ontological Shift of Hermeneutics Guided by Language. So those are the three parts. Now, within those three parts, he's extremely meticulous on how he breaks these things down. Mm-hmm. So what we have with part one, but really, let me just say something. Let me just say something about the forward here too, because look, the way that you read a book is from beginning to end, not from the beginning according to the translator or the editor. Never read those. Always only read what the author himself has to say. And Gadamer begins with a forward to the second edition. So I'll cover a few things there. I'm going to hand it back to Kryptos, and he can chime in as much as he wants. And then I'll begin what I find so striking about the opening of the text, because see, we need to understand what is Gadamer up to, right? What is the purpose of this 600-page text in front of us? We get a kind of inkling of that based on the structure of the book with regard to parts 1, 2, and 3. So we're on the right trail, but we need much more clarification. Now, in the foreword, it's just really kind of amazing. Now, that you also have to keep this and be very wary of forewords too, because, well, especially for a second edition, because that means that the author has already received all the criticism, all the praise, everything that goes along with publishing, and now he's going to respond to a number of different things. So don't expect to really understand everything that's going on in the foreword, right? Because he's presuming that the reader has already read the first edition, right? So he's talking to readers who have already read it, but you can still try to work your way through it and see if anything stands out. And what stands out to me with regard to this foreword. Now, I've got an older edition than Kryptos has, so my page numbers are a little off, but this is Roman numeral 27, so page 27 in mine. And what he says is, let me. He says neither does it ask it only of science and its modes of experience, but of all human experience of the world and human living. In other words, he's talking about modern science, the problems of modern science. He says, what are the conditions of our knowledge? He said, by virtue of which modern science is even possible. How far does it extend? And so then he says, the following investigation, in other words, the following investigation also asks a philosophical question in the same sense. All right, what's the same sense? Well, he just said, what are the conditions of our knowledge, by virtue of which modern science is even possible? So, the entirety of the book is to answer the question of what are the conditions of our knowledge. And then he says, it asks a philosophical question in the same sense. He says, but it does not ask it only of the so-called human sciences, which would give precedence to certain traditional disciplines. He says, neither does it ask it only of science and its modes of experience, but of all human experience of the world and human living. So talk about the question of knowledge writ large. It's about everything. He says, this is a question which precedes any action of understanding on the part of subjectivity, including the methodical activity of the and he puts it in quotation marks, interpretive sciences. He says, and their norms and rules. And here's the part that kind of sticks out to me, especially. This is his indebtedness to his own teacher, Martin Heidegger. He said, Heidegger's temporal analytics of Dasein, now he's talking about being in time, Heidegger's masterpiece in 1927, Being in Time. He says, Heidegger's temporal analytic of Dasein has, I think, shown convincingly that understanding, there's that word understanding again. The word understanding is absolutely crucial. What do we mean by understanding? He says Heidegger's Being in Time effectively has shown convincingly that understanding is not just one of the various possible behaviors of the subject, in other words, of each of us individually, but the mode of being. So something about understanding is inherently linked to our very mode of being, whatever that means. Our very mode of being of Dasein itself. Now, for Heidegger, Dasein, it's two words. It's da and then sein. The da part means there, and the sein means being. So Dasein is your being there, right? In other words, your presence in the world. And so the mode of your presence in the world, what Gadamer is saying is that somehow this thing we call understanding is inherently bound up in that, in the very fabric of our being. And he says, so Heidegger has shown convincingly that understanding is not just one of the various possible behaviors of the subject, but the very mode of being of Dasein itself. In other words, it is the mode of being, not just one, but the. He says, it is in this sense that the term hermeneutics has been used here. That's this issue of hermeneutics, interpretation. That's what Gadamer is saying here, is that understanding as constitutive of our very being, right, our presence in the world, is what he means effectively by hermeneutics, in the sense of that's going to be the so-called ontological meaning. That's just a fancy word of saying a structural foundation of being itself, what makes being possible. And he says, not caprice or even an elaboration of a single aspect, but the nature of the thing itself makes the movement of understanding comprehensive and universal. So understanding is not just one, but the definitive mode of our ontology, right? In other words, what makes being, our being, Dasein, possible itself. And what Gadamer is saying is that it's not just the constitutive element, but it's comprehensive and it's universal. That's going to be key. Like, so he's wanting to get beyond subjectivity. The subject, each of us individually, what Gadamer is saying, through understanding, if we fully appreciate what all is involved in understanding, that will lift our subjectivity into the realm beyond our own individuality and subjectivity, but into the realm of a comprehensive universal. So in that respect, understanding is going to be supervenient over our very being, right? What it means for us to be. And then just one other thing I wanted to add here is he says, we're certainly entitled to ask. Now, this is on my page, Roman numeral 31. He says, we're certainly entitled to ask the reflective historical question. Why, just now, at this precise moment in history, has this fundamental insight into the role of effective history and all understanding become possible? Now, he's previously described what he means by effective history, but it's essentially our tradition is what he has in mind here. Our tradition as a people, and the insight, the fundamental insight, he says previously, is he says historically affected consciousness. So something about human consciousness that has been historically affected, in other words, constituted by its history, its tradition, is so radically finite. That's crucial, radically finite, that our whole being, affected in the totality of our destiny. Okay, so not just our history, but now he's talking about everything regarding our future-oriented selves. He says, so our historically constituted consciousness is so radically finite that our whole being, affected in the totality of our destiny, inevitably transcends its knowledge of itself. He says, but that's a fundamental insight, which is not to be limited to any specific historical situation. So our history guides us in our very consciousness, but in so doing, if we understand it properly, we transcend that to a kind of, that's going to be the element of the universal and the comprehensive that I just mentioned. So that's going to be the fundamental insight is that Gadamer is addressing in the next paragraph I started with, is that why just now? Why is it that now we're just now seeing that fundamental insight? He says, my investigations, in other words, the totality of this text, my investigations offer an indirect answer to this question. Okay, indirect. Why does it have to be indirect? Why can't it be direct? That's a question to keep in mind. He says, my investigation offers an indirect answer to this question only after the failure of the naive historicism of the very century of historicism, in other words, the 19th century. What Gadamer is saying is that historicism defines the 19th century. And what we need to understand about historicism is that it is an outgrowth. This is my own interpretation here, but I can argue it quite persuasively. It's an outgrowth of modern science. History comes from the application of the mathematical sciences to the phenomena of the world around us. Now, that requires explanation, but I won't get into that here. But the 19th century especially was defined by history in the same way that the 17th and the 18th century were defined by mathematics. And so what Gadamer is saying is that the history of the century of historicism was the 19th century. That's when we have all this just baffling array of all these philosophies of history, these various, giants in the field of history writing histories of everything. And we still stand in their wake. It's foolish of us to think that we're not still fundamentally influenced by them. He says, so the failure of that, so that has failed, is what Gadamer is saying. He says, only after the failure does it become clear that the contrast between unhistorical dogmatic and historical, so you have two opposing camps, the unhistorical dogmatists. I rather take offense to that phrase, but whatever, because I'm an unhistorical person, versus the historical. And then he provides a clause where he gives us another way to understand what that means. He says, between tradition and historical science. Okay, unhistorical dogmaticism is tradition versus historical which is to say historical science. And then he says, even again, he gives us another way to phrase it, between ancient and modern. Okay, unhistorical dogmatic, that's ancient. Historical is modern. And he tells us that it is not absolute. Okay. So it's what he says becomes clear is that the contrast between tradition and historical science, or the contrast between the ancients and moderns, is not absolute. That's going to be definitive. In other words, he's saying that there's not fundamentally a radical break. There is segue from one into the other in such a way that they define each other. And then he says, the famous quarrel of the ancients and the moderns ceases to pose real alternatives. That, in many respects, is everything. But we have to understand what the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns is. Now, that's something I got into in one of my own recordings, but I need to clarify that further. Now, we're not going to go into that here, maybe in a different discussion, but suffice it to say, the quarrel of the ancients and moderns starts in France in roughly the mid-17th century, stretching through the 18th century. And the question was this. It really goes back to the Renaissance. But the question was this. When we read so-called historical documents of antiquity, for instance, Plutarch's Lives, the question of the ancients and the moderns was, because there was no history prior to roughly the 19th century. I mean, it's slowly building in the 18th century, but it wasn't its own field of study. It was the field of rhetoric, noble rhetoric. And the reason it was that field, right, and also Xenophon, right, Xenophon's Anabasis, Xenophon's Life of Cyrus, these were not histories. They were understood as rhetoric. In other words, displays of human greatness that we could incorporate into our own lives. The questions of the ancients and moderns comes around to a question of translation of Latin originally, but then also in Greek. Do we even have words that correlate in our contemporary usage to their usage of various ancient words? That's a serious question, because if they do not, then what was on the table for discussion was whether or not we can even read these people for benefit in our lives today. And so you had two schools of thought. You had the ancients who were saying, yes, we can still read them and we can absolutely benefit from them. And then you had the moderns who were saying, no, we're so radically bound in our own time that those books are basically just closed books. The best we can do is just sort of pick away at them philologically in terms of greatly knowing their language and siphoning through just enormous minutia, all the way down to the artistic designs on the coins. This is what they were arguing about in the 19th century, all the way into the 20th century. They were arguing about the artistry that was on the coins in order to even understand a single line of Virgil or Homer. I mean, just think about that, right? And so what Gadamer is saying here is that distinction is really not that great. So in other words, what Gadamer is providing here in this book is a way in which to synthesize the ancients and the moderns, which is to say tradition, right, as he's already just told us, tradition and the historical sciences. And so he's doing something, and this is going to come up extremely important once we get into the text proper, the first few pages. This is why Gadamer is so heavily reliant upon Hegel. Now, he's not a Hegelian, but he relies deeply upon Hegel because, at the end of the day, Hegel was the great synthesizer who wanted to establish, and sort of in the tradition of Leibniz, he wanted to establish a continuation and a way in which you could take the ancients and everything that they got wrong, and you could combine them with the moderns, which is to say most especially modern science. You could combine these two so that you have, in Hegel at least, you have the Aufhebung, which is to say you have one thing, then you have something else. They're in radical conflict, but through that radical conflict, they are not so much. I mean, the English translation of the word is sublimated, right? Sublated,
Mm.
sublated. I don't like that word because it takes away from the German. What the German verb aufheben means is that uh, you possess and you protect, and then, I mean, it's multivalent, but you possess, you protect, and then together with that possession and protection of it, you have something even greater with the possessing, protecting continuation of it, right? So that's what Gadamer is offering. Gadamer is effectively offering, looking over the entire tradition of philosophy, going all the way back. I mean, just all the way back from the ancients and the moderns. Gadamer is offering a new approach, a new, I don't even want to call it Hegelian, but it's in the tradition of Hegel, of a history that is protective of the past, while also including the science of the moderns, looking into the future. This is effectively his project. So he's in many respects a new Hegel, but not in the sense of a Hegelian. He's not doing any of that, but he's in that tradition. So that's effectively just the forward, the two things that stuck out to me in the forward. And I'm going to hand it back over to Kryptos. And then after Kryptos says everything he wants to say and goes through all that, then I'll provide a kind of little, just an itemized kind of detailed list of the first couple pages of and why you have to be very subtle in reading Gadamer, because he's a deep thinker, and he doesn't reveal everything, because again, what Gadamer requires is that you actually do philosophy. He's not going to do the lifting for you. You've got to do it. But
yeah, you
the
can
reward is
underline
enormous.
stuff on every, like multiple things on every page. Like it's just, there's very little. Yeah, it's a 600-page volume with very little fluff in it.
Yeah,
And that's the striking thing, is that there's almost nothing wasted in the book as he's going. That's the striking thing too. Anyways, for those that are using the white covered second edition, the passages that Athenian was talking about are on page with the Roman numerals 34.
yeah. Thank you for that, because I have the older same translation, but it's from Continuum.
It's the Continuum publication. So that'll help, because some people have been asking about the Continuum publication and this one. And I think Continuum also reissued that one. And that's the one with the glasses on the front with the pink cover.
Right. That's
right.
The one you want. That's the one you want. I have the first version of that Continuum, and you want the one that Kryptos is talking about, because all of the references that you will ever find in English to anything from Gadamer is going
from
to
the white
be
covered version.
Exactly. They're going to be to the one that
from
Kryptos
Continuum
is working for. Right. So always follow Kryptos' pagination here in this, not mine.
But because people will probably have two different versions, if we can bounce back and forth. And they're, as we have been discovering, the pages are not that far apart, sometimes like a half page apart or so once you get into the actual numbered pages.
But man, when you're trying
headings regular.
But when you're trying to find specific citations, it's enough to drive you insane, and you'll want to throw the book out the window.
So. Oh, exactly. Yeah. No, and I'm trying to do it on the fly while I'm trying to listen to you, and I'm trying to I know, I remember reading that, but okay. So for the reader, like most of you, I come by philosophical hermeneutics in part because it fascinated me in undergraduate as I was preparing to go to seminary, and continued to fascinate me as I was taught how to, exegete the scriptures in seminary, which I found, because I had read Gadamer, the way that they were trying to teach me in graduate school was frustrating. So there's a number of different things going on. So you'll have on the one hand, what you would call the hard sciences and hard scientific methodology. And although Gadamer doesn't really directly deal with that, a lot of what he's saying will have application to that as well too. To maybe, for if the reader is interested, a way to maybe apply Gadamer into the hard sciences and what we would traditionally know as the scientific method would be to read something like Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, because there Kuhn makes the argument that all scientific advancements are done on the basis of intuitive inspiration. And what we know of as the scientific method are merely ways to demonstrate things that you already know intuitively. And so it's usually in the sciences, a lot of what goes on as scientific research is actually post factum. It's after the fact. You're not actually gaining understanding. You already understand things. You're just trying to demonstrate the thing that you understand to others. And so that's a very, I think, a good thing and because then that allows you, I think, an avenue for folding back in what we're going to learn with Gadamer. And actually, the scientific problem actually becomes much greater when you're interpreting text, because there is the question of, on the one hand, does a text just simply self-evidently present itself? So this is what in biblical hermeneutics, we might call this the plain meaning of the text. And on a certain level, texts communicate plainly because there's words. But, if you're using an English translation of the Bible, there's already a layer of interpretation done for you. Somebody has done the heavy lifting of bringing it from Greek into English, and they have made translation decisions. And although biblical translation is generally extremely conservative on the whole, even among liberal translations, because there's conventions and so forth. There's you'll a lot of times see conventions from the King James carry themselves forward. A good example would be the Lord's Prayer. Give us today our daily bread. It's probably better translated, give us today our tomorrow's bread. So there's, but people don't generally vary, and then there's the whole thing of, how sexual relations are described in the conventions of scripture and these sorts of things as well too. So there's all these language of convention that goes along with it. So even then it's not really self-evident. And as we're talking about this whole question between the ancients and the moderns, it became a real problem as after the Reformation and into the modern period, as these older texts were discovered, the question began to be raised, how can we even connect to the older texts? And this is where the scientific examination of the text becomes in vogue, what was deemed the new hermeneutics. And so the idea is that you would do a quote unquote scientific examination of the text. You would do language critique, formal critique. You would examine the societies. This is where, like, Athenian is talking about, using the face of a coin to interpret, lines in ancient texts and so forth. You would do form criticism, historical criticism, social criticism, textual criticism. And this is textual criticism is the whole stuff of the Q document, J document, the primary source, is Matthew prior to Mark or Mark prior to Matthew? Does Matthew use the text, Matthew and Luke use the text of Mark or not? All of these questions are, you get into examine the language and so forth. Now, the idea then with this is that once you've done all of this work and you've exhumed the text, that you then draw out of the text. This is sort of the idea of exegesis. You draw out of the text, as opposed to the word eisegesis, which is to impose yourself onto the text. So exegesis, you draw out of the text. You're basically looking to draw out what you might almost call a universal idea. So you have a kind of rational idea. So you would look at the sort of the main idea of the text. You have its supporting ideas. And then this main idea of the text now can be stated in the way that is, in a sense, timeless, because it's now like a rational, you've exhumed it from the text scientifically. Now this idea then you can carry forward into the modern era, and now you can apply it to current situations. And this is where you get the idea that sermons now have to have applications, right? This is how it's all downstream of this idea that every sermon must have a practical application, because you've taken this idea from scripture, brought it forward. And now in terms of modern philosophy, you have, where we are philosophically, you have to render it useful, right? And this is sort of the post-Machiavellian world of making, that which is true in a sense is that which is useful. We don't worry about its absolute morality or whatever. It's just utility is the main thing. And so you render the text of Scripture, it has utility now because we can apply it to today's situation. We exhume this universally. And what Gadamer is making the argument that that's a load of garbage, and that you can't exhume the text in this way. There's no way to sort of stand over the text. And so what Gadamer will do is now he's on the other hand in this divide between ancient and modern. He will also argue at the same time that the text is not closed off to us. And this is where the notion of that at the end of section 1, he begins to develop this idea of play. And this is where the notion of play becomes very, very important, as you think. But so you're entering in, and it's hard for people to understand, to grasp this. And it really does challenge for what you might call people's traditional ideas of what, say, things like the Word of God mean, right? The direction. But as we get into it, I'm not going to dump everything here now because it's probably better as we get there by doing the philosophy. But in many ways, what Gadamer wants you to do is to enter into, shall we say, the game of Scripture, like the rules. And so you're trying to, on the one hand, to understand is to properly play the game that Scripture has established for you. And this, because this is often the two major areas where hermeneutics comes into play are legal theory and biblical interpretation, right? So you'll see with the notion of, and this is where you get into how do you interpret a constitution, right? It's the same problems that of interpreting a constitution are the same problems of a text. And by the way, being an originalism is the same theory that I just detailed for biblical things, is that you exhume the original intent of the author. You now have a universal that then can be applied to modern legal, like to a modern legal situation, right? And so originalism is basically the same kind of scientific approach to hermeneutics. And the two are very similar. And Gadamer is basically going to argue that that's kind of, I don't know, a load of crap, but it's just, these types of methodological approaches cannot guarantee that you will read the text properly or understand it at all. And as a so part, that truth is then closed to you. So the question remains, and this is one of the things that Gadamer is going to talk about, is this notion of a living tradition. This is, say, a thing that the philosopher Augusto del Noce really hammers on with his idea of ontology or ontologism, is that for Gadamer, a tradition like Scripture, like Christian theology, can exist, and it really only properly exists when it's on the time, like Heidegger's Dasein, when it's on the horizon of the present time. So it exists. So how then does the text of Scripture come to live again on the horizon of time? How does a tradition become living? And so Gadamer is looking and examining this process philosophically. Now, there's certain things that and he ultimately wants to do this materialistically. But if you, as a Christian, can take what Gadamer is saying and hold, there is a possibility. This is for me really where it was really reading Gadamer that impressed upon me the necessity of reviving the mystical tradition for Protestants, because you cannot use method and rationality to fully understand the Scriptures. You cannot rationally guarantee that you will understand the Scriptures, nor can you rationally guarantee that if you approach texts and the history of your tradition, that it will live merely as a rational exercise. And so, and we'll even get to God. I just texted Athenian the passage that I'm saying, like, okay, here's the passage that I remember from Gadamer. When I find it, I'll text it to you. And I did this yesterday. And Gadamer just drops this bomb and then just moves on and just leaves it there for you. And you're just boom, mind blown. And we'll get to that on page 120 or 121. But once you understand and you can integrate Gadamer into then a proper Christian understanding. And this is why, again, I was reading earlier in the year, I was reading Pavel Florensky, because he makes the Russian philosopher in the early 20th century makes the exact same point, is that the proper grasping of a living tradition can only be done mystically. And Gadamer is saying, and this is why, in a sense, like Athenian was saying, Hegel becomes so important for Gadamer, because Zeit, spirit, a Geist, spirit, becomes so important in a sense for this, because it is spirit that in a sense binds you across time. But Gadamer's looking at it like Hegel does as kind of a materialist sort of thing. And so you're not having to deal with the religious question, but you're still in a sense embracing what is essentially a mystical concept in a materialist way for understanding, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's gonna reveal a lot of these cards just in the opening pages here. A few of them, I don't want to say I disagree, because see, being a good reader means that you approach the text as a matter of principle. You approach the text as something that might very well contain the truth that you don't know yet and that you need to know. And so I always have my own hermeneutic, my own hermeneutical principle, is that I go into anything worth reading saying to myself, okay, this is more than likely true, and I don't know why, and so I need to learn. So we'll see. I'll explain how that arises. But what we get, and this is again, this is sort of a way that your listeners can also think of how to even go about reading. The main questions I always get are, how do you take notes? Like, what's your process and stuff like that. So I'm revealing my process here. It's nothing fancy. It's no different than probably what most people were taught. They don't really teach it anymore, though, because people just assume that, your mind is an assembly line you can dump books into. And so they say, all right, read the first 200 pages of Gadamer for next week's meeting. Right? It's like, what? They do that with everything. Right? I've seen that there are professors on X who brag that they will cover all of Augustine's Confessions in one class meeting. They will also cover the entirety of Plato's Republic in 2 class meetings. In fact, one professor at Harvard apologized to his class for spending so long on Plato's Republic by giving it 2 class sessions. I mean, give me a break. But here's the thing. Absolutely pay attention to the titles of the sections that you are in. So, what do we know about part 1? Well, he tells us, part 1, subtitle, the question of truth as it emerges in the experience of art. Okay, everything in part 1 that we're about to read, always keep that in mind. Always go back to that and keep asking yourself, okay, what could that mean? Right? With every section you read in part 1, go back and ask yourself, what could what I just read mean concerning the question of truth as it emerges in the experience of art? Now, keep in mind, what he doesn't say there, which he expects his readers to understand, is that the question of truth arises in areas outside of the experience of art. That's going to be a problem, because Gadamer is saying, no, we don't want to go down that road. We want to see how it emerges in the experience of art. That
we're going to set aside all those other questions, and we're going to answer them by looking at this question.
Right, but this is where Gadamer's own historical presentation of everything becomes important, because he's going to provide an entire history of all of this from all of his predecessors. And in so doing, he's going to point out why their approaches have been wrong, or not necessarily wrong, but not sufficient, and why they need to be supplemented by something that he's going to provide here.
Mm-hmm.
So the question of truth, first of all, truth is itself a question, right? That's key, right? Because it's not necessarily something that we just already know, right? That's the main obstacle for most people getting into philosophy, is they think they already know what the truth is. And Gadamer is saying, no, we need to reawaken the question of truth, and especially as it pertains to the experience of art. Okay. Part 1, Section 1. He titles it, The Significance of the Humanist Tradition for the Human Sciences. Okay.
And even above that, there's transcending the aesthetic dimension.
Right. He's going to get
so
us.
How do you transcend? Yeah.
Right.
Transcending right. is the ascension of, like, that's the whole thing of translating knowledge from the past
right.
to the present. So transcending the aesthetic dimension.
And something to keep in mind here, because Kant is going to become definitive for all this, transcendental, right? Transcendental, right? That's one of the things that people have to really pay attention to. When you are dealing with a philosopher who specializes in hermeneutics, then you are dealing with someone who's very, very attentive to the exact words that they use, and they know those words and they use them for a reason. Now, just as proviso, before I get going here, Gadamer is one of those. See, this is the bottleneck that has occurred in the Western world. Our historical situation is this: we have an enormous amount, over 2 millennia, of thought that we sit atop, and we also have more ways to access it now than has ever even been existing in human history. So when you're dealing with these first-rate thinkers, they have spent their entire lives buried in all of it. So they know a lot of it. And in order to even be able to read them, they are in many ways assuming that you're at least very familiar with a lot of these things. Mm-hmm. So all of these various names, right, that Gadamer is going to start listing, most people probably never heard of them, but they are absolutely definitive. They are significant, pivotal figures in our intellectual tradition.
Well, and maybe just to interrupt you for just a second,
sure.
This underscores the differences between the humanities and the physical sciences. Because in the physical sciences, innovation requires plasticity.
No one reads Galileo. No one reads Galileo anymore.
Well, yeah. Right? And most scientists do their best work in their 20s. Like, if they're going to make discoveries, they do it when their minds are the most plastic, because it's nimble. Whereas
now the audience doesn't realize that Kryptos is mocking me right now, because I got into philosophy very late. I was almost in my 30s, and so.
Well, you've read a whole lot more than I have, so that's and much of my reading has been in biblical studies. But the thing is, though, if you look at many of the major philosophical works and you look at many of the major biblical commentaries, it's not exclusive, but a lot of the significant works are done later in life. And so philosophy and history rely on crystallized intelligence. So Gadamer is writing Truth and Method. I think he's already an emeritus professor by the time he writes this, if I'm not mistaken. And
let's hold on a minute. Let me emphasize something. Gadamer almost outlived Father Time. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Gadamer was responding to most of his critics when he was in his 90s.
I know, it's crazy. And like, well, in the introduction, he just sort of gently says, I hear there's a lot of critics. I understand the points, but, once you've written something, it acquires a kind of solidity that seems satisfying. In other words, yeah, whatever. You guys have your criticisms. I get what you're saying, but the argument stands. Deal with it. Yeah. But that's kind of the right of old men to say things like that, right? Right. As a 24-year-old whippersnapper, you tend to want to go and start making revisions right way. When you're in your 60s and 70s, you can just say, like, yeah, screw it, the argument stands.
Yeah. There's a long tradition in the great books themselves that refer to the fire of youth. The flame of youth, these kinds of things. Now, you need that for philosophy, right? You've got to have that sort of rebellious spirit, that thumos inside of you.
But you got to hold it till your 60s, until you've read enough to actually be that you can do something significant. That's the point that Athenian makes, is that you in order to read Gadamer, you almost have to be in your 60s and 70s and have spent a lifetime reading these texts to begin with.
Gadamer is a lot like, for instance, Richard Rorty and Leo Strauss. The books that Richard Rorty writes and the books that Leo Strauss write, they are canvassing just a who's who of the greatest thinkers. Richard Rorty is one of his most easily accessible texts. He's constantly referring back to people like Proust, Heidegger, all of these people, and so if you haven't read them, right? If you haven't read Proust, which most people haven't, how are you going to follow what Rorty's saying? And that's what Gadamer is doing here.
And this is what makes, say, a thinker like Carl Schmitt so remarkable, is
same
the
thing
depth of which he's read. But he did a lot of his writing in his 20s and 30s, which is like crazy to think of the depth of knowledge he has, and just genius level ability to grapple with all of these texts, assimilate them, and then develop a stream of thought out of them as he was doing so on the fly. That still holds up very, very well.
Yeah, I recently did a recording on what was seemingly the topic of Christianity, paganism, and atheism. But I mean, that was there, but it also involved just a who's who of the 18th century. And a lot of people are like, man, I never even heard of these people. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I went all the way through graduate school up through the PhD, and I never read most of them. But when you read, for instance, Carl Schmitt's book on political romanticism, he's buried in all this stuff. And he's listing all of these people that I was discussing and more. And he's read so much of them. And so that's the level of a kind of humility, not full blown humility that one would think in the typical sense, but that's the kind of humility that we have to bring with us to these great readers, right? I saw where someone was trashing Gadamer's Truth and Method on X, probably as a result of knowing that you and I are doing these discussions. And they said something like, I fell asleep by page 20. It's like, well, okay, all right, that's not for you, right? Philosophy is not for you, right? Depth of thought is not for you. These people are so bought and sold into the notion that you can watch a quick 5-minute YouTube clip or read some silly thread on X that says, the 10 points for knowing Gadamer, or the 10 points to Plato. But that being said, let me just sort of get back to the point.
Sure. Yeah. No, I took you off rails.
Oh no. Yeah. Oh no, you're fine. Look, once you take me off, I don't even need anyone to take me off. All right. I will go down my own rabbit trails and irritate the hell out of listeners. But okay. So, the significance of the humanist tradition for the human sciences. All right. The humanist tradition for the human sciences. So Gadamer is deeply concerned with the human sciences, but he wants to get to them. He wants to get to the understanding of the human sciences in terms of the humanist tradition. Well, what is the alternative? Well, he's going to tell us it's the natural scientific tradition, the tradition of modern science. But he begins his section with section A, titled "The Problem of Method." All right, everything that you're about to read in the next roughly 6 pages, you absolutely have to stay focused on that. The problem of method. All right, we want to know what the problem of method is. Well, he gets into it right away, and he says, he brings up this word, Geistwissenschaft, right? Geistwissenschaft. Now, in German, that's a compound of Geist, and then they add the S to it, which means that's the genitive. In other words, it belongs to the Geist of, right? That's usually how you would translate the genitive, is just of. The Geist of Wissenschaft. Wissenschaft is, it can mean learning in general, but it comes to take on the meaning of science, just strictly science. So what he says is that he says the human sciences of the 19th century were governed, this is the opening sentence, were governed by the model of the natural sciences. Okay, that's the problem. Gadamer's going to offer an alternative, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
he's taking us by way of the humanist tradition. And he points out that the occurrence of this word, Geisteswissenschaft, spirit of science, is from a mistranslation of the final chapter of John Stuart Mill's book on logic. But that's how it enters into the German lexicon, is by way of John Stuart Mill.
But he's also doing a thing, Athenian, where he's playing it back. So this is what I was talking about in terms of the mystical tradition. So in a sense, you have natural sciences, but you also have, in a sense, the science, the scholarship of spirit, right?
Yeah,
and so he's working the word both ways. So in a sense, what we're going to do is examine sort of, in a sense, the scholarship of spirit. And in a sense,
right.
We're going to try to capture the essence. And this is the whole thing of philosophy, of examining the words that you use and the ideas behind them so you don't use them casually. I mean, this is what made Socrates such a pest, right? Is that, okay, let's talk about this word that you use. And I do this with my wife all the time. It annoys the snot out of her, right? But Geisteswissenschaften is this idea of the science, the study, the scholarship of spirit. And that's in a sense, and not just merely historical sciences.
Right. This is going to be something that becomes so definitive of the late 18th into the 19th century. The German word Geist, a lot of people are familiar with it by way of something like Zeitgeist or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Geist in German, it can mean very commonly three different things. It can mean mind, it can mean spirit, or it can mean rather a third sort of more vague, broad understanding of intellectual/emotional. Now, what Gadamer is going to do here in a minute is he's going to relate that word Geist, spirit, to the history of the concept of Bildung, which is broadly understood as culture. He's going to point out that the history of culture goes back to a kind of mysticism or mystical origins in German, which is going to be very important. But just so the readers have an understanding of how complicated that word Geist is, the very first translations of Hegel's masterpiece, The Phenomenology of Spirit, it's the Phenomenology of Geist. It was originally translated into English as the Phenomenology of Mind, right? And later translators were like, no, Hegel doesn't really mean mind, he means spirit. So then it became Phenomenology of Spirit. So that's what's going on here is how do you make scientific the mind or the spirit
or the collective consciousness?
Right. And so we need to really understand what that word means. Now, Gadamer points out in a few of his endnotes, that's what's great about his endnotes, is that he points out a number of secondary sources to go to read about these things. Most of them are in German, unfortunately, for the English reader, but he does provide English translations when available. But what he says about this is that the analogy is always to the natural sciences. So, and now he brings up, he just right off the bat, he's going to start bringing up a lot of people that most people never heard of. Helmholtz. All right. So who is Helmholtz? Well, we don't have to get into that, but what he refers to is, he says in his famous speech of 1862 about the natural sciences, he provides a kind of dichotomy of two ways to understand the methodological ideal of the natural sciences. One of those is going to be, as he says, the logical. In other words, logical induction, right? How do we make inductions from things? And then what Gadamer points out is, inductions just provide us regularities. He says, but then it becomes problematic because from those inductive regularities, people begin to make deductions. And he says, so the ground is really quite unstable, particularly for something that has to do with the human sciences, right?
I was going to say in the paragraph right before he mentions Helmholtz, he talks about this would be the bottom of 4 and top of 5. He talks about how people approach the study of history to develop, in a sense, the laws of history.
Right.
Right. So
and he says there are none with regard to the human sciences. Right. That's a problem.
That's right. And so, but a good example of this would be, say, something like elite theory, right? Where you're trying to, in a sense, what are the laws of regime change? And so you then you look at the historical record, and you then do scientific analysis of it, and you exhume from the historical, you exhume these laws that then you can apply to today to analyze today's historical events and understand them. Now, that's not to say that there is zero validity, but what Gadamer is the case that he's making is that one cannot elevate these to the same ideas. And he even comes to question in the end, like the notions of like physical laws or natural laws, but they will get applied the same critique. But this notion that while this knowledge may be useful, and even in a sense, scientific knowledge may be useful, to then develop this notion of laws is to misunderstanding what you're understanding. Even things like gravity and so forth can have a utility, and elite theory can have a utility, but this idea that you are creating now universal laws that are then applicable regardless of historical context is, you have, in a sense, this is a misguided understanding of understanding.
Right. And what, just to sort of dig into the details here, what he says is, he says, what kind of knowledge is this? Right, that understands something because it understands that it has come about. He says, and he uses quotation mark, what does science even mean here? And then that's when he goes into...
He actually uses that phrase. It's very modern. Like, what does science even mean here?
Yeah, and that's when he goes into his discussion of Helmholtz. And I'll just sort of add for the interested listeners, I dug up the PDF that he refers to that contains this translation of Helmholtz's what he calls the famous speech of 1862. It's on my Telegram. It's free. These things are very important because he's going to have constant reference back to Helmholtz throughout. And it's also important because so very few of these people have been translated into English. It's rare to have that PDF of translations of certain aspects of Helmholtz, right? Not much of Helmholtz has been translated into English. But it turns out that Helmholtz is absolutely definitive, along with Humboldt. Don't get those two confused. Helmholtz, Humboldt, both Germans, both at the same time frame, but both entirely definitive for the rise of the modern research university, which is entirely dependent upon the discovery of history as its own field of study. Gadamer knows this, and he's going to reference it. But what he says is that with Helmholtz, what you get is he at least breaks up two kinds of induction. He says there's logical induction, right? That's going to be the so-called exact sciences. And then he says what Helmholtz does is then he provides a kind of induction for the not exact sciences, in other words, not STEM, but the inexact sciences. Those are the human sciences. And this is when we have the reference to a very crucial word for everything that follows: tact. He says
the artistic instinctive induction, right?
The artistic instinctive induction. And what Gadamer says is that's really a psychological understanding, and it's dependent upon this thing that's called tact, right? And now we have to understand tact is going to become very important because it's going to be the foundation of how Gadamer brings in tradition. Just shortly. But then but what Gadamer says is, look, Helmholtz was just entirely working with both of these distinctions. He was still working within the realm of the logical. And he says that's inadequate.
That's right.
He says then he points to the so-called historical school. And then and the reference there is to Droysen. Droysen is key. He's another author who doesn't have very much translated into English. There's some, but not much. But Droysen's famous claim, right, is that history in the 19th century, Joyson says this, history needs it's Kant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what Kant did for philosophy was he pulled off a kind of Copernican revolution, although Kant doesn't really call it that. He references Copernicus, but he doesn't. But the point is this: what Kant does is philosophy always understood itself in terms of what the mind thinks outside of itself. So it was always oriented to that which is outside of itself. Kant's revolution is that he turns that around and says, no, we don't even have access to things outside of ourselves. In other words, he's solving the Cartesian dualism by saying it's not even a dualism. What we do, the only thing we have access to is the inner workings of our mind. So he takes philosophy from outside of our mind and brings it all into what's within the mind. And what Joyson is saying is, Joyson says history needs a Kant, in other words, which takes the traditional understanding of history, historical sciences, and inverts them in a particular way. Now, we don't have to get into that way, but then he gets into Dilthey. He says, Dilthey tried to further this. He finds shortcomings with Joyson, fundamental shortcomings, and then he finds fundamental shortcomings with Dilthey. What's definitive of Dilthey, he says, is that science requires that one sever one's bond with life in order to distance oneself from one's own history. Okay.
The attempt at objectivity.
We're in the realm of objectivity, but Gadamer, with a very keen eye, realizes that if you want to be objective with regard to history, it's even going to be more radical than being objective with regard to science, because that means that you cut yourself off from your entire tradition, right? It's no longer a matter of just your own passions or interests involved in the pursuit of knowledge about one particular object of science. No. In order to make science, in order to make history scientific, you have to deliberately sever yourself from your entire tradition. And that's going to be where Gadamer finds the fundamental flaw. He's going to say, no. What Gadamer is going to say is that this is where he's going to bring in his understanding of historical consciousness. Mm-hmm. He's going to say that everything that we are, our historical consciousness, is dependent upon, it's constituted by our history. And then there's going to be more qualifications there, but that's mm-hmm. going to be the important thing there. And what he points out is he's saying that what they're trying to do in this, and severing themselves from their own tradition to better know history as an object, in other words, make mm-hmm. history itself objective, is he says what they're doing is they're imposing an epistemological independence of methodology in the human sciences. And what Gadamer is saying is, no, the method of knowing history is not independent, at least not epistemologically independent, from the history itself. These things are absolutely linked inherently, of necessity.
Yeah.
Now he points out, it's interesting. He does quote Bacon at one point, but he misquotes Bacon, and that's and the devil's in the details with Bacon, because you can't just sort of cherry pick him. But that's neither here nor there. I mean, that's just sort of me being pedantic.
Well, it's interesting though too, just to jump in for a second here, Athenian, where he quotes in this, this notion of English empiricism, and
right.
with that you have Scottish utilitarianism, and this is something that we've discussed in the past, is this severing of metaphysics, and that knowledge becomes that which is useful, right? So and so with Machiavelli, he stops worrying about morality and just worrying about what is useful in terms of affecting political change.
Right.
And in that sort of manifests itself then, sort of its fruition comes in Scottish utilitarianism, that the practical and the useful becomes the true. And so, and what Gadamer is arguing, and this is what he thinks is severing, is with this notion of objectivity. In essence, what Gadamer's saying it without saying it, even though he's focusing on the human sciences, he always kind of has a side eye to the hard sciences. He's saying that the hard sciences, in their quest for utility, have given up on the notion of truth. and then conflated the idea of utility with truth. And Gadamer is saying that this you cannot do, because if you separated yourself from your subject matter, you are alien to it and you cannot understand it. And then, so this passage that you were talking about, I have it underlined in my version. He was a modern man, and the world of our forebears was no longer the home of his spirit and his heart, but a historical object. It's separated from him. This is page 7 in my edition. The antithesis shows that for Dilthey, scientific knowledge obliges one to sever one's bond with life to attain distance from one's own history, which alone makes it possible for that history to become an object. So now you're gaining, quote unquote, objectivity. But
hold on. Think about what he's just said there, though. In order for history to be a science, the human has to sever his bond with life. Well, okay, full stop. That's no longer a human.
Well, and then as a Christian, think about your interpretation of the scriptures. In order to interpret the scriptures scientifically, you have to sever your bond with the scriptures and they become an object. The scriptures become useful for you, but you're no longer understanding them because they are now an object. And this is, I think, the thing that modernity is, that while we have gained great, scientific knowledge of the scriptures, we severed ourselves from the living text. And this is what Gadamer's concern is. And this is where it shows up in biblical interpretation. Because this is what people have to really understand what modernity is doing. You think you're gaining all of this understanding about the text. You think you have you think you have a rational, that you're doing true theology. It's conservative theology. And what Gadamer is saying, that the cost of that is that you have turned your own tradition into an object and you become alien to your own tradition.
Yes. So let me sort of clarify what Gadamer doesn't include here, what you're talking about. And Gadamer is absolutely aware of all of this. Everyone in Germany was. This is with Eichhorn. For the interested reader or the interested listener, Eichhorn. Now, if you don't know German, don't expect to find anything that you can read about him because he hasn't been translated.
And nobody wants to either.
But Eichhorn was the one who coined the phrase higher biblical criticism. And specifically with Eichhorn, he's the one who introduces the Bible as literature, right?
Yes.
So we're talking about the roughly the 1750s through the 1850s, so that 100-year span of time. And what people need to understand, this is also the rise of the Bible as myth, once you interpret it as literature. Eichhorn's explicit about this. He publishes what is just about the most influential commentary on the Old Testament in particular that was ever written, which, and I go into some detail about this in a previous recording I did on Christianity and paganism, but I'm clarifying all of it much more in my upcoming discussion of it. But what people don't realize is that Eichhorn's books on the Old Testament, they hit America by storm, just absolutely by storm. And pastors in America at the time, they were fighting over who got to keep they just simply called them the Eichhorns, right? You've got an Eichhorn, right? In other words, his commentary on the Old Testament, they were fighting over him because not everyone could afford them. And when some older pastors, famous pastors, were dying, they would leave their estates, their libraries, and you'd have all these young pastors coming up, and they're like, okay, I want the Eichhorns. Like you guys can have everything else in his library. I just want the Eichhorns. That's how influential it was in America. This is directly involved with.
But they were read in German because they weren't translated.
Yeah, all of them knew German at the time. And this is heavily involved in the Boston area. But that's for a different discussion. The point though is that, I think there was something else I was going to add there, but, I forgot. Anyway, I've gone into too many rabbit holes.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, now I remember what I was going to say because this segues directly into what he immediately says.
Right afterwards, yes.
This is going to be definitive of Gadamer's, I don't want to call it an ambivalent relationship because it's not, Gadamer's relationship with Kant. Kant, in many ways, represents exactly what Gadamer wants and also exactly what Gadamer does not want. So it all involves the separation of the so-called noumena from the phenomena. That's going to be the problem.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that's great about Kant is that, or according to Gadamer, is that with Kant, ethics does not belong in the realm of nature. It belongs in the realm of reason, which is this is going to be the fundamental link to tradition for Gadamer, is that what you have, see, what Gadamer is going to say of all of the analogies of the scientific method to the human sciences, they're all grounded and they culminate in Kant and what Kant does. And that's going to be a problem because it's okay if the sciences go that way, because Gadamer is in agreement about the sciences. He's not going to throw the fruits of the sciences overboard. He wants to keep them, right? Historical sciences, right? He wants to keep them. But what he laments is the I guess the unity, or the we could say the occluding, right? The confusing of the natural with the ethical. That's what occurs with utilitarianism. In other words, ethics really kind of gets thrown overboard because it's just a matter of how useful is it for you or for other people. Well, that's very dangerous. Gadamer does not like that because that is the greatest challenge to tradition, right? We
Mm-hmm.
don't think of tradition in terms of what's useful for us now or what. No, it's absolutely wrong. And so Gadamer absolutely appreciates Kant's emphasis on ethics being grounded in reason, but not nature. Because what Gadamer is saying is, if you ground ethics in nature, then you're grounded in natural science, right? Nature and natural science. You're going to end up with utilitarianism every time because there is no significant force of ethics in the realm of the natural. This is where Gadamer is in agreement, because Kant, what Kant refers to the human being as sociably unsociable. Kant is fundamentally, with regard to understanding human nature, a Hobbesian. In other words, the state of war, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so they have to combine, joining these kind of contract theories and things like that. That's going to be problematic for Gadamer, but he does appreciate the fact that Kant was on the right track, separating ethics from the realm of the natural, because you'll never get ethics that, in other words, you will never get a sense of duty, obligation, if you ground ethics in nature. Kant grounds ethics in reason, right? And in doing so, Kant creates this new thing under the sun known as duty, obligation. And what Gadamer appreciates about that is that can be applied to one's own tradition. Right? That can be applied to one's own tradition. And so that's going to be his appreciation of Kant. What he does not appreciate about Kant is going to be how it is that, because remember what Kant does, he takes everything from the outside of the mind and grounds all of it entirely within the realm of the mind. In other words, the noumena. He takes all the phenomena and says the phenomena, our understanding of the phenomena is entirely dependent upon the noumena. In other words, what's in the mind.
Mm-hmm.
That means that objectivity, which Kant officially institutionalizes, it is entirely grounded within subjectivity. Now, this is not to say that, you can't find objectivity. Kant never makes that case. Kant says you find objectivity by way of rationally understanding the subjective. The problem with that, though, is that once you get to the realm of, as Gadamer even says, what we refer to as judgments, right, with regard to
Mm-hmm.
art, especially with regard to art, right? This is the third critique, the most important critique.
Yeah.
Especially with regard to art, it's very easy to slip into the realm of what we would otherwise know of as the religion of culture, right? In other words, art
Mm-hmm.
for art's sake. And the religion of culture is all the bourgeois people, the bourgeois, right? The middle class. They just want to, they're not concerned with, what the meaning of art is, they're concerned with the presentation of the art. Like, hey, look at my clothes, man. Look at my watch. Look at my shoes. Look at my house. Look at the paintings that I have. I go to museums. I go to concerts. But they don't go to the concerts to appreciate the meaning of the art. They go to these things so that they can just talk about them with other people, right? And say, yeah, we went to listen, we went to the Louvre, right? It's like
Yeah.
they're what Nietzsche would refer to as cultured Philistines, right? They're not
It's
even
the distinction between fashion and taste, which Gadamer will get into as well too.
Right. That's going to be the culmination of what he's constantly building on, this notion of tact. And where does tact come from? Tact is going to come from. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, he introduces it right here, and it goes by very, very fast. And if you're not paying attention, and not only that, but
from what I saw is it occurs just in one sentence. It occurs twice, but separately, just in one sentence. And if you blink, you're going to miss it.
It's right after the text that I just read before. So again, page 7 in the white edition. So we may indeed acknowledge that Scheer and Dilthey's handling of the inductive and comparative methods was governed by genuine individual tact. Here it comes. And that such tact presupposes a spiritual cultivation which indicates that the world of classical culture and the romantic belief in individuality survive in them. Nevertheless, it is the model of the natural sciences that guides their conception of themselves as sciences. So what he has just said here, if you don't, the implication, what he's basically just said here is that this thing called tact emerges out of a spiritual cultivation in the ancient world. So in other words, there is this sense that you cannot understand the old tradition, biblical, classical, historical, unless you are emerging from it and shaped by it, right? And then a little farther down in the next paragraph, right, Dilthey refers to the old Baconian aphorism, to be conquered, nature must be obeyed. And so there is this sense where he's throwing this out there and recontextualizing it, basically to say, and it's that old medieval thing, I believe so that I might understand. And Gadamer's basically saying right here that instead of objectivity, what is required is a kind of radical subjectivity where you are immersed in the subject of your own tradition, that it becomes a part of you and that you've been cultivated into it. So that tact presupposes a spiritual cultivation, and that spiritual cultivation is what elevates one and allows one to understand and then even stand apart from, without being cut off from, one's own culture. And this is that difference between that we'll come to see between taste and fashion, and the relationship between the two. But he's going by this very, very fast in his critique of objectivity. And what he's saying is that, and this then of course comes to the natural sciences, that you can't even in the natural sciences, like understanding comes the same way. You have to be immersed in your subject matter, and you have to be cultivated into this sort of classical culture, romantic, and the world that surrounds them. And that's in a sense what Thomas Kuhn says about the actual practice of doing science, is that's how it works in reality, is that people are cultivated into the and then their insights emerge out of that cultivation. The art and craft of learning to do science in that regard.
Yeah. So 10 pages after he first introduces Helmholtz, and this is why, again, you have to understand a lot has happened in those 10 pages. So he covers an enormous amount of ground, and then he even goes back to Helmholtz and he says this. He says the way that Helmholtz describes how the human sciences work, especially what he calls artistic feeling and tact, in fact presupposes this element of Bildung, which is German word for effectively culture. I have to be careful there. But it presupposes, so tact presupposes the element of culture within which the mind has a special free mobility. But then he says that this still misses the point, because Helmholtz doesn't fully understand everything that's involved in that notion of Bildung. But that's just sort of a teaser. Just to go
Wow.
back for a second.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to go back for a second. What he points out after he initially mentions Helmholtz, when he's referring to Mill, and remember, Mill, the mistranslation of Mill gives us the word Geistweissen. So I slurred that. Geistweissen. You have to enjoy the German language, because unless you're wearing a bib, you're not going to be able to speak it properly. But it's such a great language. But Geistwissenschaft, he goes back to Mill, and what he says is that this new notion of science, modern science, he says the fact that the new mechanics and their triumph in the astronomy of Newton were a model for the sciences of the 18th century was still so self-evident for Helmholtz that, and then this phrase is everything, the question of what philosophical conditions made the birth of the new science possible in the 17th century was utterly remote from him. Let's make sure we understand. The question of what philosophical conditions, in other words, the emphasis upon the science itself by Newton and everyone else following, they entirely ignored the philosophical premises required of that scientific approach. That's what they missed. And then he points out
it was just useful, so they ran with it.
Right. That's the Machiavellian element of effectual truth, right? What gets the job done? And then he goes into that discussion, as I mentioned, about Droysen and the historical school. But going through Dilthey, leading into Kant, is he says that the great accomplishment of the 18th century in Germany, so in other words, Germany's specific contribution to all of this. Now, remember, what section are we still in, right? The problem of method, right? We're still fundamentally trying to understand what the problem of method is. The problem of method is that all methods presuppose the analogy of the natural sciences, which he says effectively Kant really just sealed the deal with that, and that's not good, not for the sciences. But that's not to say Kant is bad for Gadamer. He's not. But he says the German contribution specifically comes from the 18th century with German classicism. And he's referring to the literature, the emphasis upon literature and aesthetics. And then he points to Herder. Now, I won't get into why Herder is so important, but Herder is effectively the one who gives us the notion of culture, not so much to be confused with Bildung, culture, Kultur.
Yeah.
Right. Herder understands culture in the sense that we all know of it today. In other words, writ large to an entire people. That's new under the sun. Every time the word culture was used with regard to the human prior to Herder, it was always specifically one human, the cultivation of the soul. Right. This is Plato's image of the cave. Exit from the cave can only occur one person at a time. With Herder, and now this emphasis upon culture writ large across an entire people, now the whole cave can leave. Right? That's unheard of. That is a radical revolution taking place. And that's going to be why Gadamer turns to Herder, but he doesn't say much about it. But the very next section is going to be emphatically about culture. So this is the way he ends that section on method. He says, in fact, the human sciences are a long way from regarding themselves as simply inferior to the natural sciences. That's the contribution of the Germans in the 18th century, with the rise of aesthetics and literature. He says, instead, possessed of the intellectual heritage of German classicism, that's the 18th century with the rise of literature and aesthetics, they carried forward the proud awareness that they were the true representatives of humanism. There's an amazing quote by Thomas Mann that I can read about this, but I'll just set it aside for a minute. Germany never, ever understood themselves as they prided themselves on their culture. They considered any influence of politics into the realm of culture to be a vulgarity. They would not profane their understanding of how they've cultured themselves with the triviality of the fleeting present. It was something that was enduring. This is radically the German contribution to philosophy, and in fact has won the day. Look at how casually we all speak of culture today. But he says, the period of German classicism had not only brought about a renewal of literature and aesthetical criticism, which overcame the outmoded Baroque ideal of taste and of Enlightenment rationalism. Now, I have to say something about that. It had also given the idea of humanity. Humanity comes directly from Herder. Herder is the first one who emphasizes the notion of humanity. Because, remember, if you're talking about the culture of an entire people, it's going to possibly be the case that there is one culture that is encompassing of all cultures, and that can be understood as humanity itself, right? In other words, the ideal that all humanity should strive towards. And he says, more than anyone, Herder transcended the perfectionism of the Enlightenment with his new ideal of cultivating the human. Now, the word he uses, the translator points out, is Bildung. So it's not culture, it's Bildung. And thus prepared the ground for the growth of the historical sciences. All right. The historical sciences come out of the foundation of Bildung. This emphasis by Herder on Bildung. Gadamer is telling us, this thing you guys call history, this is where it comes from. 18th century Herder, right? I mean, people should just sort of pause and say, okay, I need to know more about this. But he says, and thus prepared the ground for the growth of the historical sciences in the 19th century. He says, the concept of self-formation, education, cultivation, Bildung, which became supremely important at the time, was perhaps the greatest idea of the 18th century. And now let's think about what the 18th century was. The 18th century was the high tide of the Enlightenment. Gadamer is saying that the greatest significance of the Enlightenment as such was Bildung, culture. And he says this concept, in other words, Bildung or self-cultivation, is the atmosphere breathed by the human sciences of the 19th century, even if they're unable to offer any epistemological justification for it. All right.
So that's the project.
That's the problem of method has been found. The problem of method is that the natural science analogy that doesn't even understand, by the way, what Gadamer said, doesn't even understand its own premises. It doesn't even understand its own philosophical premises. That problem of method is properly understood, according to Gadamer, in the realm of Bildung, culture. That's the foundation upon which the human sciences themselves grow. And then no, go ahead.
I was going to say, and we also have the reader also has to remember to just note that he's building it from the ground up, from humanism, and not from the classical understanding, in a sense, from God, from revelation from God down. And so that's, if you're not paying attention, that shift goes by very, very fast as well too.
Right. Did you see what I did? I forgot one of my own hermeneutical principles, because remember what I said at the very beginning? Everything from this entire part one, you should always go back and refer to its title, The Significance of the Humanist Tradition for the Human Sciences. Gadamer is pointing directly, always, to the humanist tradition. And it's exactly as Kryptos just said. Exactly. You nailed it. It's from the ground up with the human. It's not from the top down with God. Now, Gadamer does provide a way in which to correct that, though. That's going to be crucial. He doesn't abandon this notion of divine revelation, or at least he has plenty of elbow room to incorporate it.
Well, and before we move on to the concept of, before we move on to Bildung, there's one more thing that we slid over quickly on the previous page where he's talking about Helmholtz. And he says, but the picture that Helmholtz gives of work in the natural sciences is rather one-sided, seeing that he does not believe in, and here he quotes, quote unquote, sudden flashes of intuition or so-called inspirations, and regards scientific work only as the self-conscious work of drawing ironclad conclusions. So this is the fundamental conflict that we have. And this is what he's talking about, offering epistemological justification for it. So what Gadamer is going to do is he's going to offer and ground understanding in intuition and not method. So in a sense, on the one hand, it becomes an all-encompassing sort of theory of understanding or argument for philosophy of understanding. But what Gadamer is challenging is this notion that method allows you to draw ironclad conclusions about truth, as opposed to sudden flashes of intuition that emerges out of your cultivation in the tradition or in the natural world. So there, and this is really where the sort of the pressure point for Gadamer with the question of method. And that's, again, beginning of this section, the problem of method. The problem of method is that it undermines the notion of intuition as the ground for truth. And it makes the false claim, he's arguing, without, and this is what he argues, without any epistemological justification for it, because you can't justify method as a ground for truth without any epistemological, justification. Method has become the ground for truth when really intuition should be the ground for truth. And that's, in a sense, the fundamental argument.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. Let me remind everyone again, this is why you need to be reading these things with good friends, because I miss that. And here's why that is so important. The German word for flashes of intuition, that's Anschauung.
That's
word,
right. We've talked about it. Yeah, Anschauung.
That word Anschauung is everything. It is absolutely everything. You don't even understand German philosophy of the 18th and 19th century if you don't have a very, very strong sound familiarity with this thing known as Anschauung. In other words, flashes of insight, right? The reason that's so important is because the first thing that Kant does in his critique of pure reason is he eliminates this notion of intuition, flashes of insight, and Anschauung from the entire tradition of philosophy. Mm-hmm. What he does, this is the first thing that Kant builds as he's working his way towards understanding or grounding the natural sciences and to establish what we can possibly even know. This is known as the transcendental aesthetic. Now, he doesn't mean aesthetic in terms of art or anything. He means perception. In other words, physical perceptions of things like light, sense, touch, hearing, this kind of stuff. What Kant does is he says all perceptions are to be limited to sense perceptions. And what grounds all sense perceptions are two things. This is also the most questionable, right from the beginning, this is also the most questionable element of Kant's entire project. He says the foundations of those two things are space and time. Space and time, sense perceptions. Kant does not allow for perceptual flashes of insight. In other words, let me be even more clear for people who do know the tradition of philosophy, particularly with Aristotle and De Anima. No nous, right? Nous, noin. That's, by the way, that's the word for which Kant derives the noumena, right? Nous, having to do with the mind. What Kant is saying is that no, we can't. It's not nous. It's just sense perception, not mental perception, not Geist, right? Because remember what also Geist could mean: spirit, spiritual, intellectual, mind. And what Kant is going to say even a little bit later is that this is one of the key. This is the call. What Kryptos had mentioned earlier is that the Enlightenment sees itself as this broad expansion of the horizon for so many people, right? We now can know so much, right? Kant is flatly going to say in the Critique of Pure Reason, we now know better than Plato. He's going to say we know better than Plato. What people understand as the Enlightenment is this broad expansion of the horizon, but in fact, it comes at an enormous cost. And so that broad expansion is actually, in fact, a radical contraction. Kant even uses the image of a little island. He says it's, I mean, he flatly says it in the first critique. He says it's very sad when you look at what we're able to establish with apodictic certainty. And he uses the imagery of a little island. He says, we can only know this little realm, this little island. Beyond the shores of that island is nothing but a vast, tumultuous sea, which we can have no knowledge of whatsoever. Things in which we can have no knowledge of whatsoever are the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and that one thing that Plato Socrates said was the whole purpose of philosophy, self-knowledge. What Kant establishes is the so-called apperceptive I, just the capital word I, like me, I. The apperceptive I, in other words, the reason for why we have thoughts at all, he says that's a closed book. We can't access it. In other words, reason is no longer, there's no longer a supervenient realm of nous, perceptual insight that you find in Plato and Aristotle and really the entire tradition. No. What you have, reason now, is just simply discursive, right? In other words, it can be logical. That's it. Perceptual flashes of insight and Chowan, that's not logical. We can't give a logos to it. That's the whole point of the divided line in Plato's Republic, right? You go, the third highest realm in the divided line is logos itself. But then above logos is the most important thing. That's the realm of nous, perceptual insight. And then you have to go back, according to Plato Socrates. Once you reach that level, then you have to go back and re-understand the entire line in terms of those things, if possible. What Kant is saying is no, not at all. And so that's going to be Gadamer's, another aspect of what Gadamer disagrees with about Kant. Gadamer is not going to allow for the elimination of perceptual insight, flashes of insight, and Chowan. Gadamer is going to make it absolutely definitive of what he's trying to do. Anyway, I just wanted to add that real quickly.
Well, and this, and I know we're going through the text at a snail's pace, but it'll speed up once we get to it because these are so foundational.
Let me emphasize for your listeners. The reason we've had to go slow here is because we have to fully understand exactly what we're getting into. Only by understanding.
It looks like just introduction or whatever, but it's like a lot happens in these early pages for the rest of the work that in many ways
everything's
things actually like they speed up in some sense as the book goes on.
Yeah.
But the other side of this too, for those, in the Christian tradition, this cutting off of the notion of intuition, in a sense, severs Christians from their own faith tradition. Because even within Scripture, there is this tension between law and wisdom. And this idea that, the whole thing of the formal obedience to the law versus, the change of heart that comes with the Spirit. And there is this sense of that wisdom operates primarily in the world of spirit and insight and intuition, and law is meant to be a handmaiden to wisdom, because ultimately there is always, in a sense, going to be situations that the law cannot cover and so forth. This is part of the problem of law. And the other problem with law and sin is, of course, that, sin invites thing, but the fulfilled or the giving of the Spirit in the New Testament is remarkable in the sense of what is being recovered in the giving of the Spirit is insight, wisdom. And this is sort of Christ as the Logos is the redemption of wisdom. Then there's that classic, and I use this all the time, is this, Proverbs 26, verse 4 and 5 of, do not correct a fool or you'll get sucked into his folly. And then the very next verse, correct the fool or he'll remain forever bound in his folly. So, so what do? Do you not correct a fool or do you correct a fool? Well, wisdom has the answer kind of lies in between. It's the intuition in the moment when you meet the fool, the answer will be given to you. Right. And so there is in passages like in Job and in the Proverbs and others where this idea that wisdom cannot be found. Right. And the problem in the garden, of course, is that we wanted the easy path to wisdom and we would know good and evil. And well, why do you want to know good and evil? Well, because then you can judge God rationally. Right. And that's the sense of that you can then create a system of law, a rational system of law, and you might even say of theology, wherein then you can judge God. And God is basically saying that, and this is sort of the message of Job, is that, no, I judge you, you don't judge me, because I was the one who created. And the sense of like, there's that whole quest of Job, how can I find a way to God? Who knows the way to God? And if only I could find God, I could get redress for my grievances in that sense, right? And then you feel the thing of Jesus, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so within this, you have in the Christian tradition, there is this, even though it's not dealt with philosophically, it's dealt with religiously, the role of intuition in the life of the believing community. And the Spirit is, in a sense, the first fruits of, in a sense, you might say, the unfolding of the redemption of wisdom for the people on earth. In a sense, what we were supposed to have learned in the garden, this is kind of the C.S. Lewis point, that we were impatient and we wanted it too quickly, that it's now in Christ, it can be properly redeemed and we can properly come to now with the Spirit, have the transformation of heart, have and as Paul says in 2 Corinthians, we can know the heart of God. So we can have this intuition into the heart of God. And thus, and this is, he says like in the biblical, the one who is in Christ is above judgment. He cannot be judged. He makes judgments, but he's not judged by others. And I don't even have my Bible with me. Let me see if I can find it here. I grab the Greek in a sense, because I think this is important for those who are Christian readers to understand, in a sense, even feel like why this matters for us as Christians. So Corinthians 2, where he says, where is it here? But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glorification. None of the rulers of the age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But as written, what no eye has seen, no ear has heard, nor the heart of man conceived, what God has prepared for those who love him. God has revealed to us through the Spirit, for the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. For who knows what a man's thoughts are except the spirit of the man which is in him. So this is, in a sense, the heart of spiritual intuition, which the third person of the Trinity, now given to humanity, opens up and recovery of intuition. And then what he says here, right? The spiritual man judges all things, but is himself to be judged by no one. For who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct it? So that brings you back to that whole sequence in Job again. And this is really what the scriptures are saying is being given to us in the Spirit, is the power of this redeemed intuition, wisdom, that you can, in a sense, know the mind of God and make judgments about the world around you with a Spirit-inspired judgment, which is like, and so once you, like, if you have a text like Gadamer and you realize what Gadamer is doing here, in his recovery of intuition, for the Christian who understands properly the biblical text, it's all of a sudden, like for me, it was like boom, like mind, like, oh my word. So philosophically, what Gadamer is going to do is to provide a philosophical grounding for something that is essential for the Christian tradition, and it then allows us to now recover and re-engage our own tradition, our own scriptures, that we no longer have to look at them scientifically, but we can read them intuitively.
Yeah. let me also
And
add
again, that's
something.
a big rant there, but yeah.
No, that's what we do, man. Let me just add something real quickly that's relevant for Kant, which is upcoming. Going back to so Gadamer has this shows the level of subtlety of thought that Gadamer has. So Kant is not always right, but he's also not always wrong. He's incredibly helpful for Gadamer, while also at the same time representing many things that Gadamer is going to have to or argue should be done away with. But remember the aspect of utilitarianism. That was the problem with ethics that gets grounded in the natural sciences. Gadamer appreciates that Kant does not ground ethics in the natural. He grounds them purely in reason. However, that's not to say that he endorses Kant's ethics. In fact, he has grave misgivings about Kant's ethics because another uniqueness to Kant with regard to ethics, or just Kant in general with the tradition, that's radically different than Aristotle, is that Kant establishes rational ethics in terms of universals. Always do something like this, or never do something like this. There is no element of prudence in Kant. It's all or nothing. That's
It's an
the element
all-encompassing
also.
system of law. Well, this is the thing that Schmidt was railing against, right? It becomes the all-encompassing system of law that has answers for everything.
Right. This is what your listeners would need to be familiar with is the so-called categorical imperative. Now, Kant phrases this in a few ways, but just think about its title, categorical, in other words, universal. The easiest way to think of the categorical imperative is that Kant says, only do that which you would will, right, that everyone do in similar circumstances, right? So in other words, stated negatively, never do anything that you would not allow to be the case in every other circumstance. No room for judgment, prudence.
No room for judgment.
Now,
or intuition.
Here is what Gadamer is going to. Gadamer wants to bring back in prudence. Now we have to understand what prudence is, and this speaks to your references to those two biblical passages. This is what's so amazing in Aristotle. I at some point I'm going to do an entire recording on just the entire text of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. But we're in book 6. This is an extremely important book 6, where he introduces it's no longer just moral virtues, there's intellectual virtues. And what the great divide is concerns the virtue of prudence, phronesis, and the virtue of wisdom, Sophia. What exactly is different between these two things? Well, prudence always takes into account the particular. Phronesis is the universal. Now, well, okay, that sounds great, Athenian. What is prudence? Well, it turns out it's really hard to define prudence, but the best way that I've come to think of it is that prudence is a threefold moment where all three things happen simultaneously. First of all, you have the knowledge, the Sophia, to know what to do, right? So you have to know what to do. Second of all, you have to have the knowledge, the Sophia, of when to do it, right? This is the word, the Greek word is chiron, right? That's when you hear the word chiron for like news, it's that banner that runs nonstop because it's always in the moment, right? So you have to know what to do, you have to know when to do it, and then the third thing is that you have to do it, right? So all three of these have to take place simultaneously. And that's what Gadamer is wanting to reintroduce into ethics out beyond what Kant's ethics gets referred to as deontological or ontological, however you want to phrase these things. I mean, there's different ways of understanding them. But that's the key, is that Gadamer has taken into account the temporality of the particular with respect to the universal. And what you have there is, in miniature, Gadamer's understanding to his relationship to the notion of authority and tradition, right? That's going to be the universal. But the particular is each of us in our own lives under certain circumstances taken into account. that tradition. But that tradition also is going to be definitive of this next section, which is Bildung. And one thing that people need to know about Bildung is it itself it's formed by the German word Bild, B-I-L-D, and then anytime you add a U-N-G in German to the end of a word, you're usually talking about the making of a noun of whatever that part of speech is, whether it's already a noun or whether it's an adjective or something like this, or a verb. And the thing to know about Bild, and this is where this is where Gadamer is going to refer to the mystical element of tradition and Bildung, is he's going to refer to a work in German. It's a dissertation. I'll have to check to see if it's been published. I know it hasn't. It might have been, since Gadamer made it famous in the endnotes here, but I don't know if it's been translated. But it's a PhD dissertation that explores the history of the concept of Bildung in German that goes all the way back to the mystics. And the reason it goes back to the mystics, according to Gadamer, relying upon this research by this PhD student, is that Bild, image, right? It can also mean painting, but build, and it's also a verb, by the way, like bilden means to sort of to paint or to make, but Bild is the image, at least in the German tradition, of Christ. And so
that's right.
Bildung was always, or at least initially, thoroughly associated with carrying in oneself the image of Christ in the move towards bettering yourself, right? Making yourself more virtuous. That's going to be
page 11, right?
key there.
Yeah. The rise of the word Bildung.
I don't know what it is in mine.
Yeah, but it's probably the same quote. The rise of the word Bildung evokes the ancient mystical tradition according to which man carries in his soul the image of God, after whom he is fashioned, and by which man must cultivate in himself.
Yeah, and it's amazing because Gadamer goes on from there to draw a very strong parallel to the Greek word phusis, nature. He says, let's see, so he's talking about the way in which it's also related to formation
Formatio.
in German.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what he says is, he says, it's not accidental that in this respect, the word Bildung, broadly speaking, culture, resembles the Greek phusis, nature. Now, let's think about how important that word phusis is. That's ground zero for all philosophy. It's ground zero for all philosophy because it means nature, and the standard for Plato and Aristotle was always what is by nature. It's also the title of Aristotle's work, the Physics, right? Phusis, which is also part of the title of his other famous work, the Metaphysis, the metaphysics, right? That's how important a word this is. And so so Gadamer is saying, look, we need to take very seriously this word Bildung, because it is so crucial in the life of man, or at least it has been, because of that element of the image of God, the image of Christ in one's soul, that it's very much resembles. Now, he doesn't say it equals or it's correlate. He says it resembles. In other words, reader, take me serious, explore this possibility. He says it resembles the Greek word phusis. That's everything. But I'm running kind of low on steam here. We've covered so much already. I'm afraid that we're going to overflow your readers. Now, there's more to say about Bildung and culture. It's part 2, because remember what the first subsection was. The first subsection was the problem of method, and then you have B, which we're now entering into, the guiding concept of humanism. So the guiding concept of humanism it has its own subsection, section 1, titled Bildung. Now it's going to have 3 other sections The second of which is the sensus communis, in other words, common sense. That's going
Yes.
to be incredibly important for tradition. And then it's going to have the third section is going to be the decline of the ideal of beauty. Then we're really getting into Kant. But let me just say something. We'll jump into Bildung next time, much
I
more
think so.
thoroughly.
Yeah. Well, only because
But
if I flip the pages, I've got massive numbers of of margin notes on the very next page. I'm like, oh yeah, we've probably got like a half an hour just on the next 2 pages.
but one thing we have to keep in mind: these are not independent. These are not entirely independent sections. These are all subsections. So the reader has to ask himself,
The
how are these
building.
related? Right.
Building is one of these pieces that he's picking up to build for us this notion of intuitive truth.
Exactly. So Bildung is related to sensus communis, common sense, in a very particular way, which is itself related in a very particular way to the decline of the ideal of beauty. And I'll simply say this about the upcoming section of common sense and why it's so important for Gadamer. This is another element of his critique of the Enlightenment. Kant writes the official essay, What is Enlightenment?, where the motto he takes from Horace is, what is it? Sarpe aude, right? In other words, dare to know, effectively. And what he goes on to say is question everything. You have to question everything. He says, ours is an age of critique. Gadamer is against that because what he's saying is that there's great wisdom to be found in the common sense, right? Because what Kant is saying is, no, there's no such, look, it might be true, it might not be true, but I'm not going to accept it just because it's common. In fact, I'm going to be radically independent and only believe what I myself can construct and demonstrate. Gadamer is saying, look, that's true to a sense, but you're very much on the precipice of the era of Dilthey, which was, in other words, to sever yourself from your bond of life entirely in order to know fundamental things. Gadamer is saying, there's great wisdom. There's great wisdom in common sense, the sensus communis, right? In other words, the sense of the community. Right? That's another way to really translate common sense, is this sense of community. And that's going to be elements of tradition, which builds upon, as you rightly pointed out, the enormous depths that he's about to just really unload on us.
Well, and I think maybe to tease the listener in a sense for next time, because remember, one of the reasons why Gadamer doesn't get discussed is because he makes nobody happy, right? So we've been talking a lot about this idea of truth, right? So, and that's where we began with the what is it? What was the title again, right? At the beginning of the problem of method and truth, right? So, but Gadamer's going to state outright here, okay, with this notion of culture, which is very, very important: Bildung, formation, form, formatio, physis. Bildung as such cannot be a goal. It cannot as such be sought, except in the reflective thematic of the educator. In having no goals outside itself, the concept of Bildung transcends that of the mere cultivation of given talents from which the concept is derived. So what he's basically saying is that the process is the universal. The process, and I know that process gets a real bad rap. Well, we have to focus on good process, right? And that somehow good process will naturally, we want good process to provide a useful result, right? And Gadamer is in a sense saying that no, that you never close off the door. In a sense, you never arrive at this thing called truth. And that understanding the truth is the process of being encultured, cultivating, forming yourself into the truth. So this process of forming yourself is itself truth, and it emerges and we'll come into the concept. I mean, this is one of the things we'll get a little bit. The concept of play will unfold this and what he means by this. But what he's basically saying here is that even though you're pursuing truth, you can never find it with certainty, and you never arrive at the moment where you say, I have the truth. But the process of pursuing it is the grasping of truth. But it's always open-ended. It's never closed.
Yeah, and just to tie it to something we belabored earlier, and I think this is correct to what Gadamer is getting at. Gadamer, in other words, is he's retaining that element of the mysterious with build-up. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what he's doing. Now,
and this process on the next page is the universal. That's the weird thing, is that this process of pursuing the truth is the universal.
Yeah, just 2 points I have to say. The first is that culture, with the actual German word culture with a K, Kultur, at the very end of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, this is in the canon of reason, which is what most people skip the canon. they love the epistemology of the middle sections. But Kant flatly says, culture is the telos of metaphysics. Right. So Gadamer is disputing that in many respects. Also, Kryptos and I had this shrew of a former professor of philosophy heckling us on Gadamer on X. And she said at one point, she said, yeah, well, Gadamer is kind of big into, authoritarianism and blah, blah, blah. Let me point out to everyone just how stupid she was in saying that. The Enlightenment, what I just mentioned about Kant and his critique of, submit everything to critique. The Enlightenment was radically against traditional authority and, tradition itself. Now, that's not to say they didn't eventually construct it, right? Kant is clear about this. I mean, the subject, us, when we follow through rigorously with reason, we arrive at the objectivity of what we should be doing, the ought from within the is, right? So that's not to say that they're relativists and they abandon the tradition altogether, but they do subject it to just vehement criticism. So that shrew of a really midwit PhD professor who should never even have been. The PhDs don't mean anything anymore. They haven't meant anything for a very long time. Most people that have a PhD in philosophy, they're morons because they just were the stooges of their various professors. But in any case, she's thoroughly of the Enlightenment. She's thoroughly liberal. In critiquing Gadamer by saying, he's big on authority. Notice what she left out. It's not that Gadamer is big on authority. He's making room for the very lifeblood of tradition. And in fact, it's more than that. He's saying, look, we can't even understand these things that we call the human sciences, the humanities. The analogy to the natural sciences was incorrect. Precisely because, and we're going to find this in this section on culture coming up in our next discussion, precisely because human consciousness itself is constituted by the very history of our tradition. So if you don't know it, first of all, and if you're not also, in knowing it, by the way, you will appreciate its incredible value. That's what makes these very fields of study that we know of as humanism or the humanities even possible. And so she was so stupid in saying that. It's just baffling. But you will get people that do that all the time. They will flatly just say, everyone knows Gadamer's been disproven. Oh, really? How? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, hold on. Show me in the text where he says that and how he's been disproven. Like, let's see some tight citations and let's see some commentary. They'll never do that. Because they're
because they read a secondary source, probably exactly. A feminist critique of Gadamer, and because they've read the feminist critique of Gadamer, they've quote unquote read Gadamer.
they're probably deeply indebted to the Frankfurt School, right, which is incredibly critical of Gadamer. And so, and they're just reading all these, as you said, they're not even second rate, they're third rate commentators of people that will never be remembered, right? They're never going to be remembered. But I just had to point that out because we do get a lot of slack for, why are you guys spending time on that 600-page tome that no one really even reads anymore? Well, the fact that no one reads it anymore, that alone should spark your interest and say, I wonder if I truly understand it. It's 600 pages, but people are dismissing it with like these little catchy phrases. That doesn't seem very philosophical to me.
No.
It might be that there's something, and just the title alone, truth, right? 600 pages on truth and method towards truth, right? This is 600 pages of truth and method towards truth. I think that might be worth my time to at least, open it up and read a couple pages to try to understand it seriously. So,
well, there we go. And so we've got through, we're 11 pages in now, Athenian. That's good. At this pace,
we're going to go a lot quicker now. We're going to go a lot quicker now. Just we had to get down
but it's again the when we look at if you look back at the index, and it is very, very important because in this opening section it begins the problem of method, but the guiding concepts of humanism, Bildung, sensus communis, judgment, and taste. If we miss these ones, the whole rest of the book just falls flat. And so you're almost better off to read those first 40 pages really, really careful and then miss the rest, the last 550 pages, because it's in these, the foundations are all laid here. These all become the key concepts that get layered and layered and layered and layered again going forward.
Yeah. That's a great point. I love the way you phrased that. I 100% endorse that. I would rather people at least say, you know what, they spent a couple weeks just on the first 40 pages. That would make me happy.
But once we get into deep, because the book just gets really fun. Once you've got these basic concepts down and you understand philosophically what Gadamer's trying to do and what the project is trying to do, all of the later examples and all of the later philosophy that he discusses makes a lot more sense. Like so questions of like Heidegger and time, and the later discussion of Kant and taste and all these types of things, and judgment and like prejudgment, prejudice, and all these notions that you have to understand you have to understand the concept of judgment before you can understand the concept of prejudgments or prejudice.
Yeah, and what the listeners don't know is that Kryptos and I have been arguing back and forth for about at least 3 weeks now, because I keep sending him references that are like 300 and 400 pages in, and he's like, "We got to start at the beginning, you nitwit." It's like, "What are you doing?" And it's because what's coming up in roughly page 250 to like page 250 to 450. It is so incredibly fascinating that you can't put it down. I mean, it really becomes a page turner once you get there. Just
it really
incredible.
Does.
Everything comes together. Yeah.
And then once we can do with the reader, then you don't almost have to go quite as line by line, because you have these big examples that you can then talk about, and we can open up, because he'll use these sometimes, like the big example of like, how do you know when a production of Shakespeare is an authentic production of Shakespeare, right? And his explanation, but you get into that, and it doesn't require the same length of time that he puts into it. We can get into it much quicker because we've laid the foundations that way.
Yeah, just to build on what you said about the first 40 pages or so, that first part one, once you seriously read that and take it deeply serious and feel like you've understood it, then the rest of the book almost becomes something that you can just sort of flip to and say, well, I wonder what's going on here, and then relate it back to those first opening pages and say, okay, that makes sense. And so that's what you all as listeners have to expect from us going forward, is that we're going to move incredibly faster now. But once we've got these first 40, 50 pages under our belt, then we're off and running, and everything is going to be much more understandable. So
there we go. But to be honest, I think that this, in part because Gadamer again, is delving into the whole philosophical tradition here, and to answer the fundamental, what he believes is the fundamental philosophical question of our age. And so, yeah, I mean, you can choose to ignore it and sidestep it if you want, but because he's drawing, you have to understand, and this is, I think, why it requires some lengths to get into it. You have to understand the discussion within which he's talking.
Yeah.
And so once you understand and place him in, like, why this idea and not that idea, why this, why Bildung and sensus communis and not, the whole process, and not, why does he mentions Mill a couple of times in the beginning, and then I don't think he ever references again in the whole rest of the book.
Yeah.
Mill is just there to set up the problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so now that we've set up the problem, we're actually going to talk about it, but we're not going to take Mill seriously because it's not a serious, in Gadamer's mind, it's just not serious philosophy, although it's tremendously influential.
Right. I mean, for the sciences, yes, but that's not what his project is. That's not Gadamer's project. Gadamer's project is to get us to understand the human sciences without reference or analogy to the natural science. So
without the baggage, I think. And then in so doing, in answering the question for the human sciences, he will then answer the question for the hard sciences, the physical sciences.
Yeah, that's what's to come, by the way.
They end up being the same answer.
Yeah, for the listeners, that's what's to come. Because remember, what hermeneutics is how to interpret texts. But it's much more than that. Because just keep in mind the opening of that sentence, how to interpret. Well, we have to interpret everything. The data that science gives us, the results that science gives us, we have to interpret that. So hermeneutics becomes a kind of supervening discipline of not just the human sciences, but also the physical sciences, the natural science. In other words, all science. And that's what he's already told us in the foreword that I read there, is that this is something that's universal.
At
least that's what he's
interesting. It just occurred to me now, and we're doing this on the fly. I want, what is it? No, I don't want the Canons of Dort. I want the Belgic Confession. And people are going to be like, what? The Belgic Confession? In part because you have to, again, this comes back down to the understanding of idea. This is Gadamer's point, is that there was a world before Kant. And there was a world, and at the opening of the section on Bildung, there was basically a world before Goethe too. and the Baroque period was a thing, right? And so as you're emerging out of the late Middle Ages and through the Reformation, okay, so now I'm going to have to find, the means by which we know God. Okay, so here's it. And the language here is very, very interesting because you're talking about how to interpret, hermeneutically, how to interpret a book. And it comes back to it because I think the pre-moderns, even in the Reformation, because they're still pre-modern, the pre-moderns in the Reformation, in some sense, understood the problem better than we do today. This is one thing you encounter again and again. Biblical authors understood the problems of knowledge and truth far better than we do today. So the means by which we know God, Article 2 of the Belgic Confession. We know him by two means. First, by the creation, preservation, and government of the universe, since that universe is before our eyes, like a beautiful book, in which all creatures, great and small, are as letters to make us ponder the invisible things of God, his eternal power, and his divinity, as the Apostle Paul says in Romans 1:20. All these things are enough to convict men and to leave them without excuse. Second, he makes himself known to us more openly in his holy and divine word, as much as we need in this life for his glory and for the salvation of his own. And so what sometimes you wonder how much, Christian influence is coming into Gadamer in this, because he's very coy about it, but he drops all these little like breadcrumbs if you're paying attention as a Christian throughout the book. But like, as you say, the problem of hermeneutics is the problem of interpreting the natural world, because as the pre-moderns understood it, it's God's great book for us. Now, there's reasons why they use that, the printing press and blah, 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 blah. But there was this understanding that the natural world has to be read and interpreted. And thus, hermeneutics is, in a sense, becomes the foundation of how you know anything. Right? So there we go. Yeah, well, we've only managed 2.5 hours, so we're very good.
This was great. The listeners should know. I think you and I could probably have just gone on like this all afternoon. But stay tuned.
Well, I was sitting there thinking, are we going to get into 3-4 hours here?
I know. But next time, we're going to really unravel Bildung culture. Right, that's going to be
sensus communis, judgment.
Yeah, you guys really don't want to miss that, because it's just so absolutely crucial for everything, even beyond Gadamer. You don't have to take Gadamer seriously or care for Gadamer, but his section on Bildung is so incredibly important for understanding things that you might not otherwise even realize are so incredibly determining of our world today. So,
and he lays the foundation in Bildung for the idea of play.
Yeah.
Right. And then that's, again, it all builds out of it.
Well, all right, brother. I got my dog nipping at me over here. Wants to go outside.
Yeah, your dog has less stamina than we do.
I know. This was great, man. Thanks so much.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
All right.